Yes, I've been working with API Days for quite a while now. So before I talk about that, let me ask the panel to introduce themselves and to say what they do and where they're from. So, Chris, please.
Thanks, Ellen. So hi, everyone. I'm Chris Corbett. I'm here representing Plaid. So my role at Plaid is a product manager, and I lead our expansion across Europe outside of the UK. For any of you that don't know who Plaid are, we're one of the leading open banking networks and payment platforms. We support over 7,000 businesses globally across various different use cases.
Superb. Kevin, please. You've got a good story to tell. Let them hear it.
Thank you, and thank you API Days for inviting me, and Helen for hosting. So I'm a commercial practitioner. I've got 25 years of trying to make financial services a viable commercial product. I've worked for 2 retail banks. I've worked for a large public sector client, and currently I'm working for a private sector client where we've got an interesting and exciting use case which brings together third-party software, customer data, ID&V, bank account verification, and puts that all together to support claims processes.
So Kevin has been a little modest, and so was Chris there. So my challenge is to get them to open up a little bit. So Kevin actually was on the team that delivered one of the best and the biggest open banking use case in the UK. And as the UK is leading the way in open banking, I would argue the world. So we'll have a look at that. But let me just say a little bit about me. I'm the founder of Open Banking Excellence, OBE as we affectionately call it. And OBE are now a global community of banks, fintechs, regulators, policymakers, and service providers. And we have a mission to help promote the growth of the sector. We believe in a rising tide and all the ships will sail. So we want to be the center of that community, driving change in the industry. And we enable our community to connect, to innovate, and a word we're going to be talking a lot about during this session, and that's collaborate. Collaborate is absolutely key for this ecosystem to work. And by doing that, everybody has the opportunity to make an impact. And I want to talk about that impact and the impact it has on consumers. So what do? We create exceptional platforms for a discussion. And we tell our client stories through content. So let's tell a few stories today and have an exceptional discussion. So what I'd like to start with is our panel is called The Path from Open Banking to Embedded Finance. Now, open banking, I want to start with a question that I will ask all of my team on day 1, and I can tell you that I will get a different answer on day 30, the end of their first month, and again at day 100. So I'm going to ask 2 experts here. Chris, how would you define open banking?
So I think open banking itself is a term. It can be used in many different ways. Many people use it in many different ways. I heard a really good analogy last week, actually, explaining open banking. And I think it fits really well with what we see at Plaid as well, in terms of open banking is almost like the plug socket. So any application, any appliance in that model should be able to plug in and access and get the power and the data that they need. That's kind of how we have open banking today, where consumers can give access to that power, to the power of the data, to various different third-party applications or appliances in this scenario, in order to power their financial use cases across different fintech apps as we see it today, but obviously expanding that beyond purely the banking side with embedded finance.
Interesting, very interesting. Kevin, would you expand on that? What is open banking?
So I think open banking means different things to different people. So is it simply a new payment channel? Is it a means to connect customers' interactions, improve their customer journeys, combine data and technology in whizzy ways? Is it a secure way to give the customer control of their payments and the third parties that they're interacting with? So I think there's a lot of different meanings, and what you've got to do, and what I tend to do with my clients, is to think about actually what is their strategy, first and foremost, and how does open banking, open finance, embedded finance fit within that strategy?
So it's really democratizing the data. It's giving us, the consumers, control over our data because we give our secure consent, and secure is the key word, isn't it? Yes. Secure consent to use that data for a specific period and for a specific purpose. Okay? So open banking, for those of you that don't know, started from an order, a CMA order, Competition and Market Authority order, and it really was to open up the markets. And it was a working title. Open banking was actually a working title, and that's how it's labelled. And over the course of many years now, there's been a big debate about whether it's a right title, but it's now a phraseology that's accepted worldwide for a secure way of giving our consent. So that's what open banking is. But how does it really work with embedded finance? And what is embedded finance? I'm really interested, Chris. You're from Plaid, one of the largest companies internationally in our space. You do a huge amount in embedded finance. What is it, please?
So embedded finance is really about taking financial service products and embedding them in the point that it matters for consumers. So to bring this to life, when we think about some of the large tech players and players that have moved into this space, we see Apple buying Credit Kudos and various other examples of this. It's really about financial services evolving from traditional, very siloed products that you might access to actually embedding these products while you're going through various different customer journeys across different applications that might not be finance applications at all. It might be a shopping journey. It might be a fintech app. It might be onboarding to different applications across the board. And really that's what embedded finance is all about, is extrapolating it away from purely a financial services organization and actually enabling financial services in different contexts that make the most sense for consumers.
A better outcome for the customer.
Exactly.
Yeah. So talking about better outcomes for the customer, Kevin, I'm curious. You were on the team for HMRC. So for those of you that paid your taxes online this year, you will have paid using open banking. And may or maybe not, you didn't know about it. So let's talk about embedded finance and a little bit about HMRC, please, Kevin.
So for me, when we talk embedded finance, we've got and I think one of the speakers talked about it earlier, you can split into three very, very simple segments. So you've got the insurance side, you've got lending, you've got payments. So you've got to determine when you develop a strategy, which one am I looking at first and foremost? It is the next evolution, if you will, of open banking. And the beauty about embedded finance is it's not just about apps. We all talk about super apps, but it isn't just about apps. It's what you can embed within a website, within a platform, within business processes. So that's really important. So the traditional days of trying to develop something which was transformative and huge and costing millions of pounds, well, actually, we shouldn't do that now. And that's a shameful plug on what I'm going to talk about tomorrow as to how to commercialize the opportunities. So hopefully you'll all be there. I think if you try and bring it to life, when you look at embedded finance, for me, what you're looking at is those services or solutions that typically have struggled in the past with finance and finance options. So now implementing a coffee shop implementing a one-click payment solution, fantastic. But actually then going beyond that and driving loyalty programs off the back of that. So that's what I think about embedded finance, and that's how I talk to my clients and customers around what they should be looking at. Not just trying to think about, can I make a payment? Can I consume data? It's actually, what are you doing with it? What's the purpose? What's the outcome that you want to try and achieve? For the public sector client that I worked for, their key criterion of why are we even thinking about open banking was to reduce errors. So 55 million transactions and 2.5 million errors. Yeah, that's in the public domain, so I can talk about that. And I am under restricted covenants. But simply reducing errors. So if you think about how much time it would take to find a payment, to allocate the payment, and then to process that payment, and that's all being done manually, not automated. So 1, error reduction. 2, simplify the process. If you've ever tried to pay taxes in the past, they were difficult. So making tax digital was a key undertaking for government. Making it easier to pay. So not just having the traditional payment solutions, but having this new payment solution was a key criterion as well. And when it was first launched, one of the key things was, actually, we're not going to advertise. We're not going to promote. We're just simply going to put it there and see what happens. And I think the stats were, and these were published as well, first month, 12 million users. Sorry, no, 12,000 users in the first month. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but for something that's brand new that's not been advertised, that was good. But that 12,000 users generated transactions of £1 million. So actually, that was pretty impressive. And I'll let you talk about the stats in a moment.
It's now, because we work a lot with the government behind the scenes, and I can actually tell you that HMRC, His Majesty's Customs and Revenue and Customs, have actually collected a whopping £7.3 billion of taxes, and they've had 0 error rate. So when they first embarked on this project, they wanted to reduce their card fees, because an open banking transaction is account to account. And reducing the card fees, which are a fixed amount, for some very, very large chunky numbers, what was a difference, a healthy difference for UK PLC. However, they now say that reducing the card fees isn't the biggest saving. So on £7.3 billion of transactions, which is 2.3 million, so 7.3 billion pounds and 2.3 million transactions. They're now saying, as Kevin said, that the biggest saving is from errors. 0, customer service, because with confirmation of payee, it just goes through seamlessly.
Yeah, and I think when you develop business cases, you've got to look at, certainly from my perspective, because I develop commercial business cases, what are you looking for as your outcome? And some might say we want to reduce our card fees. Some might say we want to retain our customers. But actually, we looked at it from multiple ways, I should say. And actually, the outcome was, how could we deliver something which was speedy to the market, low cost in development, the ability for it to change quickly, the ability for it to scale quickly, and it's a low risk entry point. So I think all of those things were really the what I would classify as value, and what was the value that we were trying to achieve there.
So that's the best use case from the UK, and as the UK is at the vanguard of open banking, right now it's the best use case in the world. But what Chris has is lots of other use cases to share and inspire. So Chris, there's one in particular that I want you to talk about. Go for it.
Yeah, so obviously as Plaid, we have a big presence here in Europe, big team working across the board, across UK, across European markets, but many people know us from the US as well, where we've for many years been leading the charge in what we'd call open banking across that space. I think to build on Kevin's points as well, I think often we see customers starting from a specific place. Cost is often one when we think about European payments. I was at Visa before, so I know all about the card schemes in that space. But actually the best use cases we see are where customers start in that space and then they quickly expand out and realize the other benefits and the other propositions that they can create off the back of open banking and beyond as well. I think that's where embedded finance, we've really seen that being pushed. So we obviously work with a lot of FI firms generally. We work with a lot of different lenders. I particularly like some of the B2B lenders, and in today's world and the challenges that are being faced, SME lending is so important to the economy in the UK and globally. There's some really interesting use cases. One in particular, You'll one of our customers, they use the bank account transactional data to do revenue-based lending to SMEs. They pull in other data points as well, and that's a key point around this is you can use open banking, but pair it with other things as well. They use ad spend, for example. That's one use case in the lenders. We also work with a lot of crypto firms. That's to really help them open, onboard, and then let customers fund those accounts. So they're more standard examples. But also, there's other embedded finance examples that are a little bit different. So here in the UK, we work with Bumble, for example. Anyone that doesn't know, Bumble is a women-powered dating app. For them, they have a premium service, and for that service, they look at using us for the account top-ups as one example, but within that journey, within their apps, in order to make that seamless and secure for their customers. And then another example from North America is John Deere. So tractors and dating, two things you might not have heard too much today. Again, they're using some of our Auth products to identify the customer before they then make ACH-based payments as well. So there's a lot that you can do and a lot that we see customers using once they start with the value prop and the use case that they're trying to solve, rather than start with, I'm trying to reduce cost, etc.
It's interesting because you've both actually divided open banking into payments and data. And we did a big piece of research in the summer. What does everybody in the industry want to talk about in 2023? And everybody said, keep it real, always talk about the use case, always talk about your end customer. But let's have two conversation streams, one about payments and one about data. So data, is there anything you want to share about that before we move on?
I think from our perspective, the data payments conversation, they should be entwined. And I think this very much comes back to, we were talking earlier around like IDMV, for example, those kind of checks, super important to the onboarding journey, which is what Plaid we're focused on, is being that front door to finance for consumers and enabling that financial freedom. Just doing payments in isolation limits your use cases massively. So you need to have those other steps in place, which are often referred to as AIS in Europe, but beyond that, so the KYC, et cetera, all these things are vital when you're actually trying to make a payment, because you need to have certainty around who you're sending that money to or who is adding the money to their wallet, for example.
Kevin, do you want to add to that?
I think when you're looking at data, what you've really got to understand is how you're going to use it first and foremost, and what data you've got, and whom you should partner with in order to enrich it. But actually, there's much more, and we were talking backstage about, actually, I've done something, an interaction has happened, but then do I just leave it? Or do I come back to it? And when do I come back to it? So now what we're seeing in the marketplace is a lot of AI and ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning approaches after the fact. So that's really quite interesting. Just dropping back into the use cases, I'm a judge at Open Banking Expo, and I see many examples, and I have to judge many examples of some interesting themes that I see coming through. So I've just jotted down two very simple ones, which I thought would just give the audience something to think about. So everybody's heard of laser eye surgery, okay? These laser eye practitioners are, they're not financial institutions. But now, through embedded finance, you can have a buy now, pay later program. You can get credit. In the future, you might even be able to do VRP with that. If you go and buy a car, going one step further, you're not just buying a loan anymore, or taking out a loan. You're potentially having access to insurance and different types of insurances. You're looking at maybe recovery options as well. And again, you've got choices of how you want to make that payment. Is that as a whole? Is that in part? Or is that delayed? So when you just bring it back to real life examples of everyday things that we do, and I know we talked about coffee earlier, it actually is just what customers are demanding. So forget open banking, forget embedded finance. It's actually what customers are demanding of us.
I couldn't agree more. It's always putting the customer at the heart of the journey, as Chris said at the beginning, which is a lovely segue, Chris. We've talked about open banking, embedded finance in the UK, and we've touched on Europe. But what are you seeing around the world and some of the challenges to really scaling around the world?
Yeah, so obviously we've seen the UK lead from a regulatory-led approach. Obviously, Plaid is big in the US, where it's more of a market-driven approach as well. In Europe, I'd say that generally speaking, we see a slight lag there versus the UK, a similar approach from a regulatory-driven angle. But where in the UK we have very firm standards, good platforms for portals for working with the banks, for example, that isn't necessarily the case in Europe. Standards can differ. For example, you might have the Polish API standard, you've got the PSD Duopoly group, you've got STET, you've got various different flavors of those as well, and some banks completely different, all slightly different across the board in Europe. That obviously creates some challenges from a standardization perspective. We also don't necessarily see the reliability that we would hope for on some of those APIs. And when we talk about payments in particular, you need extremely high levels of reliability because it's a user-present journey and it needs to work when people are trying to make a payment. That being said, from our side, like customers and the people trying to use these services shouldn't care about those things. And that really from our perspective, it's about providing a platform that people can work with, it works, and they know what's happening with that. And Plaid and other TPPs deal with the bank side of things. So Europe's improving. It's on a good road as well. We see a lot of positive movement there from an infrastructure perspective, from an app-to-app linking and deep linking perspective. And then outside of that, we obviously have a lot of markets globally who are looking at open banking very closely and have been developing their own policies. Canada was mentioned earlier. Australia has obviously taken more of an open data approach to this side of things. And then other markets like Brazil as well, which I know, Helen, you were over in not too long ago. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Well, I will, but let me just before I jump in, Kevin, challenges around the world?
So again, we talked backstage on this, and my analogy is this, that you're given the ingredients to make a roast dinner. How you make it and what it ends up looking like are going to be different from one household to another household, and that's what banks have done. And so the one thing that is the constant is the consumer trust, and that's what's required. So somehow, internationally, parties need to get together to work out a legal and regulatory footing so that the handling of financial data can flow very easily and without error and without penalty. And I think when you take that into context, and I made some notes here, Juniper's research estimated that there is likely to be £206 billion of online payment fraud by 2025. So whatever is being produced, whatever is being made, whatever is being developed has to be done in a compliant way. And whether that's standards driven or whether it's not, it still has to be done in a compliant way where there is always the customer at the heart of those transactions and interactions.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Chris, do you have anything to add?
I was just going to say that I think the other part to this is obviously keeping in mind the use cases that we've talked about and the end users of these services. Standards will be different. We're seeing that already. That is the case. Some are following others. They're closely aligned. Others are slightly different. I think from our perspective, it's all about creating this borderless experience. I think borderless payments is obviously key, but borderless data flows as well. There's a lot of use cases in the lending space I talked about where you can be a very good, sure bet in one country and you change country and all of a sudden you can't get a loan. Crazy use cases in our mind, and that's the kind of thing that we focus on so that if you work with us or any other provider, it should be that global experience, one standard experience. And I think that's what we all have to keep in mind when we're working on these kind of standards is that's fine to have local nuances, but actually it does all need to roll up into something that works across the board.
I couldn't agree with you more. Now, one thing I do need to, before I talk about Brazil, is to thank API Days for, is that we are producing a pioneering piece of research with our partners, the World Bank, Oxford University, Accenture, NatWest, and the Department of International Trade, the DIT. And API Days very kindly sent out a survey for all their communities globally to fill in. And this will be the first data-driven view of open banking and open finance around the world. So we've surveyed over 20 countries to give a unique view of open banking around the world. And this will be coming, we will be publishing this around Christmas time. So I'll ask API Days again to send you that as well. So I just want to take this opportunity. So if you did fill in that survey, thank you very much. This will be an ongoing piece of work now. We were asked to do it by regulators and policymakers around the world. So we've invested very heavily into this research with our partners at Oxford University. So I'm delighted to be able to share that with you. Because of the work we do with regulators and the DIT, I got invited, our government invited me to Brazil to fly the flag for the UK. So thank you very much, Chris, for giving me the opportunity to speak about this. So in the UK, we created the blueprint for open banking, and we're at the vanguard. However, there are countries around the world that, Brazil is a really good example. Their regulators flew to, Aristides and his team flew to the UK, and also they went to India, but they flew to the UK to look at lessons learned, and they implemented open banking or open finance, as they now call it, from the 4th of May in Brazil. And they are moving at a phenomenal pace. And we all talk about this phenomenal pace, and I wish there was a different word, but it really does sum up what they are doing in Brazil. They are moving from payments through to health, through to education, through to insurance, wealth and pensions at a very, very rapid speed. However, their regulator has just asked them to pause a little, so some of the larger banks can keep pace and they can get more payment initiation. But one of the things that I learned from Brazil, I went there to share lessons learned from the UK, and I came back having learned more from Brazil. First of all, if you haven't been, it's an absolutely fabulous country. I was given a very warm welcome, and maybe API Days and OBE could have an event there at some stage. But one of the things that I did learn, and everybody should be very proud of this, is that we all now are looking, and we see this with our audience figures. We have colossal figures when we're talking with our familia in Brazil. The world is looking at what is happening in Brazil. But it all started with the UK. Not only did they fly over, but it actually started with, when they flew back to Brazil, they actually said, okay, what do we do next? And it was the British consulate that funded a report that gave them a roadmap, and that report funded a big tender, and that was won by a British company. So I think what I would like to say, in addition to what we're doing with the index, what we're actually doing in the UK is supporting a lot of other countries around the world. And that goes to what both Kevin and Chris are saying around us having that borderless embedded journey. And there is no real reason why the UK can't now lead those global standards and lead and be that benchmark and consolidate our place on the global stage, in my humble opinion. About time we had some good news from the UK, don't you think? So we've had a look around the world, okay? I'm curious, looking at the ecosystem. I said that this industry works on collaboration. That's the banks working with the fintechs, and it's all collaborating as opposed to competing. When we started in the market, everybody thought the banks and the fintechs would compete. The fintechs would eat the bank's lunch. But the absolute opposite has happened. It really is a David and Goliath model. There's a huge amount of collaboration, and it's a fascinating ecosystem. And I know Plaid do a huge amount. They've got a lot of stories to share about the ecosystem and their partners, Chris.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to even pre-open banking and everything around that. If we look at various different ecosystems, there's pre-existing models in place. When you think about e-commerce merchants, for example, there's various different PSPs that exist today. We work with, for example, Nuvei on that point. You have the likes of Square and Block on that side. These partners already work with, and there's various different other ones. You think about accountancy firms, et cetera, and some of the software providers. There's loads of different entities who already have very specific business needs, and they have providers that work with those. So partnerships is really a cornerstone of anything that we do in this space. We have our own partners ecosystem, which has 50 plus of these kind of partners, because we appreciate that that's how the world should work and does work today. they have knowledge in certain areas, and then Plaid can plug into that, and they can plug into Plaid wherever they are in the world in order to tap into, as we said, whether it's new data sources or whether it's to initiate payments. But really the crux of it is you work together to create the best end result for that end consumer, whether that's an insurance use case, if it's a pension, or something a little bit more different, as I mentioned earlier, but very, very common to have like a partnership model for us, and that's definitely something we continue to see and expect to see explode with embedded finance.
It's, we believe at Open Banking Excellence, if you get great people together, amazing things will happen. So Kevin, I'm interested on your take on, and when people collaborate as opposed to compete.
I naturally think very different from most folk who are technically driven. They think about, we've heard about open banking, we've heard about embedded finance. How do we? I actually don't think about it that way. I turn it on its head and I think about habits, and I think about what customers and consumers are doing. So to simplify, you think about, for me, I think about platforms, I think about marketplaces all coming together to deliver end-to-end solutions. And when you think about that, these are sometimes quite diverse services, products, all coming together, but with one common theme. And I've got an example of that, which is, say a professional service provider creates a platform, and what they're really trying to do is they're trying to service, in this particular example, weddings. So when you think about weddings, what are the things that you're thinking about? You're thinking about suits, cakes, dresses, cars, venues. And actually, if you just think about that as an end-to-end process, there's a lot of work that needs to go into that. But now if you embed finance into that, it actually becomes really easy, because you can do online quotes. You can look at how you pay for certain things and when you should pay for certain things. You can look at the data that you're getting back and determine, actually, is that good value, is that not good value? And then collaboratively, these partners can work together to give end-to-end discounts, end-to-end loyalty, and much more, because actually, if you think about a wedding, it doesn't stop with just the event. You've still got the holiday to go. So, there's an entire process, an end-to-end journey, and if you think about what we do as human beings, everything we do is an end-to-end journey. From the moment that you get up to the moment that you come back and go to bed, it's an end-to-end journey. And along that process, super apps, if you want to call them super apps, websites, business processes, can all interact seamlessly and in a very nice and concise, trusted way to deliver the sort of end solution or the end product or the end service to you. So I look at it from the outcome basis as opposed to, okay, how are we going to build this thing? Which a lot of people would start from, and then they use consultancies and they spend millions of pounds and nothing's been delivered. So think about it in a slightly different way, and you might get a quicker result in terms of how you can collaborate, who you're collaborating with, and actually what purpose are we trying to solve? Because I think that's the most important thing. What are we trying to solve for?
Chris, do you have anything else to add to that? Because you do a huge amount of behind the scenes on collaboration, big players.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, to Kevin's point, very much agree in terms of that piece. We're seeing a lot of experimentation as well, even from providers that you wouldn't necessarily expect, or, as I mentioned, a lot of tech firms have long acknowledged the space but not necessarily done anything in the area. I think we've moved past that. We've hit a maturity where there are a lot of use cases that aren't just like betas and various different things. Like we're very much beyond that. And that, again, has helped with various different partnerships because it just makes it easy for providers. You don't have to worry about it. You can work with someone who works with someone, and the experience for you as a wedding company, for example, is that you've worked with existing providers and it's just there, it just works. And that should really be how it works, rather than having to go to separate institutions to set up something, whether it's financing or whatever. It can now be all baked in. And really that's what we're focused on as well. And without partners, you struggle to do that.
It just works. That's a great line. Because, I mean, I've been looking at this screen down here. It says the path from open banking to embedded finance. Well, when we started Open Banking Excellence 3 years ago, we talked a lot about open banking. We did a huge amount to educate the market. And then embedded finance became an add-on. But it's absolutely a joy now to talk about it as a seamless process for customers, so it just works, isn't it? So that's what we were talking about 3 years ago. I'm curious, and we promised to get this back on track and to finish. So I want to wrap up. So what should we be talking about this time next year? If they kindly invite us back on this stage, what should we be talking about in open banking?
So I think from my perspective, I think we're really excited about the whole open data side of things. There's obviously some regulation in the UK that's going through various different houses at the moment. We're very excited about that and being able to extend these use cases beyond open banking, which is very much focused on your bank account and a payment account linked to that, but being able to extend that usability to things like pensions, insurance, various different products across the board. Utilities is a big topic at the moment, and I can't help but feel like if we had open data and we were a few years down the line, then all of the issues we're facing with obviously utilities and the cost there wouldn't have necessarily been negated, but certainly could have been mitigated in some ways to help control finances for people. So for me, next year, hopefully, we're discussing about new use cases and the early beginnings from an open data standpoint.
From data. So I was recently out in Saudi. We've got a team helping to write the standards out in Saudi, which will be released on the 27th of October. And I described data as the new oil for Saudi. I really do think it is the new oil. So Kevin, what should we be talking about this time next year?
So firstly, I think it's an extremely exciting time. And I think I'm in a privileged position to be not dealing with the technical aspects, but actually developing business cases and use cases. And that's really quite exciting. And I think what we'll see a lot more of are small businesses integrating embedded finance within their processes. So, at the moment, a lot of small businesses just use Facebook and tag on Stripe at the end. Actually, it needs to evolve to much more than that. You don't need, what I find a lot of organizations that I go to, the first thing they say is, it's expensive. It's going to cost a lot of money. Actually, it depends on how you do it. It depends on what you want to try and achieve. I've seen a lot of expensive deliveries, and I've seen very cheap ones. And it's all determined based on what you want to achieve as an outcome. Do you want to try and solve everything in one go, or do you want to take bite-sized chunks, deal with it, move it, change it? And again, I talk about websites, business processes, apps. So how are you communicating with your customers? So you've got to have the right strategies in place. And again, another shameless plug on tomorrow. I'm talking about making the most of your commercial outcomes of your investment. In that presentation, what you'll hear is how do you go for a process, a commercial process that's viable, that's not going to cost the earth, and how can that be delivered quickly? And I think that's one of the key things. What we've seen is open banking came out, and we were all very excited, but also really nervous. And now suddenly we've accelerated to embedded finance. And we're now talking already about open data without any standards, without any regulation. So we're already ready to go. But actually, and some organizations like Plaid have already started working on things behind the scenes, such as VRP and other different types of payment solutions and other ways in which you can move data and share data. So I think that's really quite interesting. But from a commercial perspective, what keeps me awake is thinking about how can we develop those simple business cases. And I gave that wedding example as a platform, end-to-end platform. Any one of you who wants to start a business could do that tomorrow. There's nothing stopping us from doing that straight away. And I think that's the exciting part. There's absolutely nothing stopping small businesses, corporates, from just going for it. And I think one of the speakers talked earlier around setting up a new subsidiary or a new business venture and just doing it. Well, why not? So that's my question. Why not?
And it's going to be companies like Plaid with their ecosystem and their drive to a more data-driven economy that will really lead the way. So as we wrap up, Chris, is there anything you'd like to finish on?
So I think all I'd say from our side is, like, for us, it's all about, as I said, the consumer, it's about the use case, and it's about eventually getting to financial freedom for everyone. That's our mission. That is what we work towards. Open banking is one means to support that. But from our standpoint, opening, onboarding, and funding accounts is certainly what we're focused on. And where that's positioned, it doesn't really matter. It's about doing that in a way that empowers consumers.
Empowering the consumer. So let me empower you, the audience, before I just say thank you to our panel. Does anybody have any questions?
Can't.
Well, I'll take that as everybody's ready to go for lunch. Okay, so let me just say that if you would like any more knowledge around open banking and open finance, if you go to our website, openbankingexcellence.org, you will see probably the industry's biggest knowledge resource for open banking. And we have our campfire on the third Thursday of every month, so you can go back and you can really swat up on it. Now, what I will tell you to leave on a little anecdote is we were filming recently a unicorn, and their chief exec was announcing his funding. And his chief financial officer came up and said, "I wanted to say thank you, Helen." I said, "Oh, great, I'll pass that on to the team. What are you thanking me for?" Well, if it wasn't for your website and the campfires that your team put on and all the information and inspiration that you've given me, I wouldn't have my job. So he actually spent night after night swatting on the information that we have on our website. Clearly, the guy was very talented, otherwise he wouldn't have got the job. So if you're wanting, or your team are wanting to know about open banking, please direct them to our website. Everybody has a day one, which is why I deliberately started by asking our panel of experts here, what is open banking? Everybody has a day one and needs to be on that journey, and everybody has a day 100. So please go to Plaid's website as well, but if you're looking for a knowledge resource, please have a look at ours and follow us on LinkedIn. So all that remains for me is to thank Chris and Kevin very much for sharing their expertise. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please give them a big hand?